Hi everyone and welcome back to Astro 10. Today we are going to continue our discussion on the solar system, talking about the Jovian planets now. So these are going to be our four outermost planets, and they're called Jovian because they are more Jupiter-like instead of Earth-like the terrestrial planets were. So let's go ahead and start with this idea. So, like I said, Jovian planets are more Jupiter-like. They're all very large or gigantic compared to Earth, and have a gaseous nature like Jupiter. Um, and most of these are hydrogen, some helium, and other trace gases and ices. Sometimes they are referred to as gas giants, so you may have heard that when you were going to school at younger ages. And they are mostly made of gas, like I mentioned, but they may have a solid core on the very inside. They all have significant planetary magnetic field uh, and rings, and that should be a comma there. Fields, rings, and lots of natural satellites. And note that I say natural satellites because they are um, a natural satellite is something that's not man-made. It's something that has been kind of caught in their orbit. So for us, our only natural satellite is the moon. Um, and we'll see that these planets have much more satellites, a lot more than we have. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about Jupiter first. So this is the fifth planet from the sun. It is the biggest planet in our solar system. Um, and note that 11 Earths could fit across Jupiter's equator. So if we were to draw 11 Earths would fit across the equator. Remember, equator would be like there. Okay. Um, Jupiter rotates once every 10 hours, so that would be its rotation period. It orbits the sun every 12 Earth years, so it takes 12 years to make it all the way around the sun. It's a gas giant and lacks an Earth-like surface, which you'll see all of these do. Um, and it does have a solid inner core, but it's only about the size of Earth. Okay, so it would be one of those 11 Earth-sized, right? That span across the equator. The atmosphere, important to know, is mostly made of hydrogen and helium. And with that, this is the overall depiction of Jupiter. And these are a couple of images of the storms in the atmosphere of Jupiter. And I will talk about that here in a minute. But I can go ahead and mention it now that the one of the most interesting things I would say about Jupiter is that it has this giant red spot, and they call it the Great Red Spot. And it's actually a giant storm that has been raging or um, doing its thing for over a century, and it's about twice the size of Earth. So that's what you see in this image here and in this image. It's that big red spot there. Okay. Um, so with that, we can talk about its moons. So like I said, it has natural satellites, and it has about 75 moons. Um, Four are very large, and that's what is in this picture right here. Of course, they're not that close to each other, but this is just an artistic depiction of all of them near Jupiter. Okay, so there's Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Okay, so that would be all of these four. Io, we'll talk a bit more about the moons in the next lecture. But just to kind of give you an idea, Io is very interesting because it has a lot of volcanic activity. Um, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to mention. I just think Io is very interesting. Um, Jupiter, believe it or not, does have a ring system. So when we think of the solar system and we think of the planets, we automatically imagine the one planet to have a ring system, and that would be Saturn. But in fact, all of these have a ring system, it's just that some are more faint. So Jupiter does have a very faint ring system. It was discovered in 1979 by the Voyager mission. So it has been observed. Um, it's just quite faint, so we can't see it necessarily to um, the telescopes that we may have, like backyard telescopes. We wouldn't be able to see it, but we could see Saturn's rings. Okay. Um, Jupiter cannot support life as we know it, but some of its moons may be able to. Underneath the crust, they have oceans. Some of them have oceans, and that may be supporting life. Um, but again, that of course requires more investigation on our side. And the one other thing I want to note is the spacecraft that have visited. We have visited quite a few other of the terrestrial planets because they're nearby. But Jupiter, since it's so far out there, and all of these other Jovian planets, we haven't really visited much or observed much close by. So we've had 7 flyby um, objects and 2 that are in orbit, Galileo and Juno. So that's just something to kind of note. We only have so much observation from these very few spacecraft. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Saturn. So this is the 6th planet from the Sun, orbiting at a distance of about 1.4 billion kilometers or 886 million miles. And it's the second largest planet in the solar system. So, like I said, Jupiter is the first. This one is the second largest. And 9 Earths would span across the diameter of Saturn, but that doesn't include the rings. So, that would be from, along here. There we go. It rotates once per about 10.7 hours and orbits the sun once per 29 Earth years. Okay, so it takes 29 years for Saturn to orbit, to make one full orbit of the sun. Again, it's a giant, gas giant planet that lacks a solid surface but may have a solid core. Note that it says might have a solid core. We don't have the evidence quite yet. And the atmosphere, again, is mostly made of hydrogen and helium. So moving on to Saturn's moons, there are 53 known moons with an additional 29 moons that are awaiting confirmation of their discovery. So it possibly has 82 moons. And here is a depiction of a few of the larger ones. And they are to scale approximately. So this would be Saturn's surface or gaseous surface, or atmosphere, I should say. It's the atmosphere of Saturn. And then we have some of the larger moons that are orbiting it. Okay, so we can see that here. It has a very spectacular ring system. It has 7 rings and several gaps and divisions between them. So if I go back here, we can see those very prominent rings. And there's a few gaps between. That would be that dark space here. So Saturn is the only one that has such a significant ring system. So that's important to know, and that's why we can see it when observing, like in our backyard, or if we've gone to. There's some outreach folks that go into Fresno areas, um, and they bring out big telescopes that you can look through. The public can, which is really awesome. Um, and we can see that if it's, of course, if it's out that night and it's dark enough, we can see Saturn and its rings. but these other ones won't necessarily be able to see it um, so easily, I should say. Okay. Um, cannot support life as we know it, but like Jupiter, the moons may have conditions that support life. Um, and there have been few missions that have visited, so even fewer than Jupiter since it is further out. We have a couple of flybys, Pioneer 11, Voyagers 1 and 2, they flew by, and Cassini orbited Saturn 294 times to be exact, between 2004 and 2017, and eventually vaporized in Saturn's atmosphere in 2017. So we have quite a bit of data, but of course not as much as we would like or have hoped. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause here, then we'll continue with Uranus and Neptune.